you.
Thank you. Appreciate you all being here with us this morning. I'm going to share my screen here so that you can follow along with me on a slide deck that I'm going to be using. Just 1 second, please. Get back to the first slide. I trust you can see that okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. As you can see, my title's a little different than the one you just heard, but it's the same topic, so worry not. First of all, I'd like to just sort of dive in and talk a little bit about the challenges that have been posed to all of us, some more than others, by the pandemic and other factors going on in our culture today. But what we really know is that the primary challenges that people experience that are up against their capacity for resilience are listed here for you. I'm not going to read all these. You can read them yourself, obviously, but I want to point out a couple that are particularly germane to the pandemic. In addition to the losses that some people are experiencing in terms of, deaths and sickness and so on, human beings have a real hard time with invisible dangers, things we can't see, things we can't identify, and a pathogen like this is certainly in that category. And this creates that kind of sense of uncertainty that we find very difficult to deal with. People don't like uncertainty. You may recall times when maybe you had some physical symptoms and you weren't sure what they were, and then your mind starts making up all kinds of possibilities, some of them catastrophic, and you really want to know, you want a diagnosis, even if it's something you don't want to hear. Having that diagnosis at any rate gives you a sense of, okay, I know what I'm up against. And the uncertainty we have with the pandemic is how long will it last? How bad will it get? Will it affect me? Will it affect the people I love? And there are no answers to that, obviously, until they roll out in real time. It's also created a lot of disruption to people's routines and lifestyles. That in itself generates a great deal of anxiety, because there's a lot of research showing that when we have routines and we kind of stick to those routines, they provide a kind of psychological scaffolding, if you will, in our lives, give us a sense of certainty and security. And when those get disrupted, our anxiety tends to go up. It also has, obviously, for many of us, created more isolation from each other. We're thankful that we have media to help us with that, but there's no substitute for primary experiences, meaning being in each other's presence. So that can create loneliness. And then the whole kind of mess, if you want to think of it that way, creates this thing we call existential angst, this sort of feeling of, boy, nothing's secure, I can't lean on anything, everything's up in the air and uncertain. And that kind of amps up this generalized angst or anxiety that's always sort of right there in the background. So I'll call your attention to that quote there by Viktor Frankl, who many of you know wrote Man's Search for Meaning. And he again said, when we're no longer able to change a situation, meaning something outside of ourselves, we are challenged to change ourselves, meaning our internal state and our capacity to handle these things. So that's what we're up against. Those are the primary challenges. The obvious thing that we require in order to meet these challenges is something called resilience. And what we have found through studies is that resilience tends to occur in conjunction with another mindset that we refer to as realistic optimism. And as you'll see there on the right on those bullet points, those are the things that people who embrace realistic optimism and have, therefore, high levels of resilience, those are the things they tend to do. Not all of them, but many of them. And resilience, again, just to define it better for all of us, is this bounce back capacity. Life knocks you down, you're able to come back up. Not necessarily immediately or quickly, but you're able to come up over time in response to whatever loss or challenge you have experienced. So we're going to kind of look at some of these elements of realistic optimism, how they feed into that capacity for resilience, so we can all get a good sense of things that we maybe are already doing that are supporting our resilience, or things that we might want to add to our repertoire of behaviors that will, in fact, enhance our resilience. So the first of these, and again, this is all research-based. I'm not making this up. I didn't get it out of Cosmopolitan or GQ or someplace like that. This is evidence-based stuff. And what it really says is that people who have an abiding sense of purpose in their lives and they act on that purpose are much more resilient. The philosopher Nietzsche said, those who have a why, meaning a purpose, to live for can bear almost any how, meaning set of circumstances. So we know that if we have that abiding sense of purpose, it anchors us when life gets tough. It's sort of like a boat anchored in a tempest. You know, it holds you in place until the storm passes, as it were. However, it's not just enough to have a sense of purpose. You actually have to do something with it. That quote there by Picasso, the meaning of life is to find your gift, that the purpose of life is to give it away, meaning to use it. And so we know that once people have a sense of purpose in their lives, that's great, but they need to find some avenue to bring that purpose to life, to bring it into the world, as it were, and to create some good from it. So when we're faced with adversity, having purpose-driven goals, as we call them, meaning action steps that show our purpose in action, is a really critical piece. A couple other things about that. When people try to apply their purpose to the world, they'll take on something. Maybe it's a volunteer effort or something they're trying to do to help their own well-being, whatever it may happen to be. These create what we call kind of moments of truth when we find out how much resilience we really have to bring to bear. And Gandhi was the one who said satisfaction lies in the effort, not the attainment. Here's where realistic optimism comes into the game. Realistic optimists are people who believe in applying full effort, but they do not expect, as a result of that full effort, to always win or succeed or get what they want, meaning they're much less focused on the outcome and much more focused on the effort itself. That's why Gandhi said full effort is full victory. So if people get involved with applying their purpose in life, but their only satisfaction from that comes from succeeding, then they're sort of setting themselves up for maybe I win, maybe I lose, and a disappointment that could come with that. Realistic optimist is like, do your best, apply full effort, realize you can't control everything that's going on around you, in fact, not very much going on around you, and then focus on the effort, not the outcome. Another way this was said was by Eleanor Roosevelt, who said during the Great Depression, you must do the thing you think you cannot do. And focusing on where we can make a difference with our purpose is part of that ability to stay anchored in the face of a very difficult situation like the pandemic. Not getting sidetracked by forces we can't control, which are mostly outside of ourselves. And choosing to find opportunity in challenges is what we call a learning mindset, which we'll get into here in just a moment. So I've mentioned several times realistic optimism. The gentleman's picture you see there on the left is sort of the guru of realistic optimism, Ernest Shackleton, who was an Antarctic explorer in the early part of the 20th century and got stranded in the Antarctic with his expedition to try to go to the South Pole and spent 2 years struggling to get out. And he did succeed, in fact, in rescuing his crew, all of them. And it's considered sort of the greatest rescue story of all time. I don't know if that's true or not, but if you want to read more or see more about realistic optimism, I'd encourage you to read a book that's called Shackleton's Way. Shackleton's Way. And it's really a description of how people can be up against enormous challenges and yet still maintain the kind of attitude and mindset that gives them the best chance, not the guarantee, but the best chance to succeed in meeting that challenge. So it was Shackleton who said optimism is true moral courage, but little asterisk on that optimism, it has to be realistic optimism, not that kind of, what me worry or, kind of optimism, pie in the sky stuff. That doesn't work. Realistic optimism means looking at what you're really up against. Consider the pandemic as an example of that. Not trying to pretend it's not there, it's not going to go away, or that it's going to go away by itself, or that it won't hurt me or the people I care about, but to realize that it is a real danger and a real challenge, but still in spite of that, be able to bring a degree of optimism based on purpose-driven effort to meet the challenge of that situation. Okay. So here's the thing that's really kind of surprising to a lot of people. All the studies that have been done on how do you build resilience, and there have been a lot of them. Most of them incorporate one thing across all those studies. Some of them have, one thing, not another, but this is a consistent theme across those studies. And that is that the best way to build resilience over time is through learning. When we learn new things, whether it's a skill or it's a mental, perspective or whatever it may happen to be, when we learn new things, we create this thing called a growth mindset. And resilient people tend to have very high levels of this growth mindset. They believe they're lifelong learners. When they get frustrated by things, they persevere, which is what learning's about, right? You don't always learn it the first time. You don't always succeed. You keep going back and trying again. That ability to persevere in the face of setbacks is critical. They like to challenge themselves. They want to learn. Even when they fail, they'll say, well, I'm going to use this failure as a way to learn something that will help in the future. They like the fact that they try hard, not necessarily if they succeed, but that they try hard. And they recognize that their attitude is critical to their ability to be resilient. In other words, I'm in charge of my attitude, right? At least I should be. I can't control the world out here, but I do have a big impact on my own attitude. So if you want to grow resilience, go learn something new. And there's lots of opportunities to do that, whether it's a new skill or a craft or, whatever it may happen to be. I have several folks I work with now who've taken up this approach to resilience and are learning things like a second language, how to play the piano, how to knit, woodworking. I mean, the list goes on. But if you think about what you know, these are things that you can do pretty much rote, right? But when you learn something new, you have to stretch the mind, you have to acquire new behaviors, and it creates this thing we call behavioral flexibility, meaning the capacity to change your approach to something based on what you're up against, which is what resilience is really kind of all about. And this learning also impacts something we call locus of control. This is a good example. Locus of control is a great example of what people in the mental health field do all the time, which is that they tell you things you already know in words you can't understand. Okay, so locus of control is an example of that. What does that mean? It means that inside of ourselves, we have this perception, often subconscious until we pay attention to it, that we're either in charge of ourselves, meaning I'm in charge of me, what happens inside of me in terms of mood and attitude and mindset, I got it. But not out here. I don't control what's outside of myself. So flip that. Somebody who has an external locus of control believes that their circumstances will dictate their inner state. So if it's bad out here, which it is certainly during the pandemic, then it's bad in here, meaning my environment regulates my emotions and my attitude. Okay, that's not good. I mean, it's good if your environment's wonderful, but when your environment is challenging or difficult or painful, then you're feeling that difficulty and pain inside yourself. So someone with an internal locus of control, even when things out here are bad, they still feel a high degree of influence, sometimes even control, over their mindset, their attitude, and their emotions. So during a time when things are bad out here, and we could certainly put this time in that category, it's really important to grow that internal locus of control. How do you do it? Again, learning is one of the primary ways we do it, but there's also some other ones. When you're up against a situation, it's important to ask yourself, which side of this line am I on? Do I feel like the environment's controlling me, or do I feel like I'm in charge of me? And if you do feel that the outside, meaning what's happening around you, is controlling on the inside, obviously that's a call to do something about that. Learning is one of the ways that internal locus of control goes up. There are other ways. Let's look at some of those real quick. Some of the more rapid ways, as opposed to learning, let's say you're in a situation and it's bad and you're absorbing all that bad and you can feel your internal locus of control slipping away, and all of a sudden you're a puppet on the string of the environment. There's some things you can do right away, quickly, that can turn that around. Okay, one of them is called power posing. Some of you may have heard about this. There's an interesting TED talk on power posing if you're a TED talk person. But power posing basically means that when we start to feel like the environment is impinging on us and controlling us and everything, we have to regain a sense of personal power, meaning, okay, I'm in charge of me. And power posing, interestingly enough, is one way to do that. We use our physiology as a way to create a mental state. We do this all the time without realizing it. So when you stand, as you see there under the sort of, that's the Wonder Woman pose, right? And you see someone standing like that, what they're really doing is they're kind of regaining some of that sense of personal power. Their posture's up, their breathing is open, face forward, muscles relaxed, all that physical stuff that says, hey, I'm in charge of me. The other way that we do that is something called a brain reboot. I'll give you a little bit more on that in a minute. Meditation, we know, also increases a person's sense of internal locus of control, because meditators have been shown scientifically to have higher levels of self-regulation over their emotional reactions, meaning they're not as knee-jerk in their reactions to things. They tend to be more thoughtful. Another one is spending time outside in nature, which I'm going to get into a little bit more here in just a moment. So let's skip over that quickly. We also find from the studies that music does that. It's got to be the kind of music you like, obviously, but when listening to music kind of pushes the environment back away a little, gives us some psychological distance from the bad stuff out there, and allows us to reset inside of ourselves. And the other thing is micro exercise, interestingly enough. You see a picture of Michelle Obama there doing 20. And what we know is that, excuse me, when we do a little burst of exercise, doesn't have to be crazy exercise, just going up and down the stairs, taking a walk around the block, you know, doing some push-ups if you're into that, whatever, it kind of resets that internal stress that we've been generating as a result of what's going on around us. So, excuse me, all of these methods really will help us to regain our internal locus of control when we lose it. Okay, I mentioned the brain reboot. Well, here you go. Here's what it looks like. I'm privileged to be a consultant to the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And this is a neuroscience research center that studies the impact of contemplative and meditative practices on mental well-being. And they have studied this method, this particular breathing method, and there's lots of breathing methods out there. But they've studied this one in particular and found that it helps to reset the mind when we kind of get emotionally hijacked, get in a really negative mood, negative place. And it does it rapidly, less than a minute. Give you a metaphor for this. What do the tech people tell you to do when your computer's, you know, slow and not doing the right things? They always say, restart your computer, right? Reboot the computer. This is a way to reboot your brain, your central nervous system. Not completely, not totally, but enough that you can regain some of that control. So as you can see from this description, it's really easy to do, and you can do it really anywhere and almost any time. Eyes closed or open, 4 or 5 deep, what we call belly breaths, or for those of you in yoga, you know, deep pranayama kind of breathing. You inhale through the nose. This is important. You pause very briefly at the top of the breath and you exhale through open lips. In through the nose, out through open lips. You do 4 or 5 of those. And what we see happening in the brain is that the electromagnetic wave in the brain begins to move towards an alpha rhythm, which is a more relaxed, focused rhythm in the brain. Cortisol levels start to drop. Cortisol is a stress hormone in the body. So this is a way to rapidly kind of get yourself back into an internal locus of control, meaning I'm in charge of me, when you feel like the environment has yanked you out of it. A couple of other things we know helps with building resilience, and that's to give to others, to practice good deeds, as we say. Kindness is contagious, as we all know. It creates a positive feedback loop. And supporting others, the studies show, when we reach out to support others, even when we're under duress ourselves, it increases our optimism and our resilience, okay? So this whole idea of giving when you feel like you don't have a lot to give is kind of like exercise when you don't feel like you have a lot of energy. You say, oh, I can't exercise, I don't have much energy. Then you exercise and you get more energy, interestingly enough. The same thing with giving. Oh, I don't have a lot to give. Then you start giving and you feel more of that capacity to give. So that's an important part of being a resilient person. And in the pandemic, there's a ton of opportunities to reach out and help others, even with just a kind word or a check-in or whatever it may happen to be. Here's another one that's kind of interesting. I mentioned earlier that routines have been disrupted by the pandemic, and they have, and that we do use routines to feel more calm, more secure inside of ourselves. But we also know that routines can get us stuck, okay? If we don't have enough behavioral flexibility and we're just constantly routine all day, kind of what we call goose stepping through life, then you lose some of that resiliency, meaning the ability to bend as opposed to break when you're up against something tough. So information, we know, does not build resilience, experiences do. And experiences, seeking experiences that make you feel more alive, more engaged with other people, more engaged with life, and that are new for you, meaning, oh, I'm outside of my usual routines, I'm outside of my usual lines, that increases resilience as well. You see the quote there, if you think adventure is dangerous, try routine, it is lethal. I would modify that a little bit and say you need both. We need routine and we need adventure. And so adventurous people who, and I don't mean like climbing, Mount Rainier, but I'm talking about the ability to step outside of your usual routines and try something new, that creates resilience as well. Just checking the time here. Okay, I'm gonna jump over this real quick. At least I think I am. The other thing we find that resilient people do is they invest in their own well-being. And I've listed a bunch of things here that people do, and there are more, to invest in their own well-being. But I want to touch on a couple of these. One of them is expression at the top. We do find that people who have an expressive practice of some kind, whether they paint, they play music, they write, they have woodworking hobbies, they work with clay, they do needlepoint, whatever it is. When we express ourselves through the use of our hands and our minds, it increases our overall sense of well-being. We also know, of course, that support, social support, is critical to resilience. And so having supportive friends or family, acquaintances, and so on helps us with that. And the rest of the things you can see here are pretty standard stuff. We all need downtime to recharge our batteries. There are certain disciplines we know that help people improve their well-being. Meditation's kind of at the top of that list, and anyone can meditate. There may be some people who've tried it and say, no, I can't meditate, but you can. Laughter really helps. So if you know people who make you laugh, or movies or books or whatever, go there once in a while. We all need to laugh, including at ourselves. And then the usual suspects, exercise, nutrition, sleep. But the last one's also important too. I referred very early on to this sense of purpose, right? Well, purpose and spirit kind of can come together often. And we do know that people who have a spiritual life and practice that spiritual life are also much more resilient than people who don't. And why is that? Because spirit takes us a little bit out of our ego. We get out of ourselves a little bit. We have a bigger perspective on what's going on. And that helps us to be calmer and more secure in the face of adversity. When you don't have a spiritual connection in your life, your life tends to compress, and you get your ego, if you will, gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And pretty soon you got that thing we call tunnel vision, and we know what that does. I mentioned earlier nature interaction. There's a ton of studies out now showing that interacting with nature does these good things. It elevates the mood, pushes angst down, it promotes emotional healing, and combats one of our more insidious problems today, which is hurry sickness, brought about largely by technology. And also there are now, particularly in Northern Europe and Korea and Japan and some other Asian nations, physicians now are prescribing something called force bathing for their stressed out patients. And force bathing is a little different than taking a hike in the woods. Force bathing means you go out into a natural setting and then you stay there for a while and wander around a little bit, but you open your senses to your environment and you try to drink in your environment through your senses. And that also we find helps to reset the central nervous system, get it out of the stress mode, and put you back in charge of you. So even nature interaction like going out on your deck, taking a little walk, sitting outside, even that will help with this. You don't have to, wander off into the wilderness. So there's nothing wrong with that. Mindfulness is another thing we see resilient people have. They spend more time in the present. They spend less time sort of litigating the past, if you will, or worrying about the future and playing the what if game. And they are very much into be here now. Okay, not all the time, not constantly, but more often than not. And so what mindfulness gives people is, first of all, they're more self-aware. They're more aware of how they're feeling, how they're reacting to things, and therefore they can modulate those responses better. They're better at regulating their feelings. They don't tend to get emotionally hijacked quite as readily as some of us do. Again, focused on the present. And we also find that people who are mindful have greater emotional intelligence, meaning they're better able to react to each other and themselves around emotional issues. So there's a number of ways to become more mindful. I gave you the mindful moments or brain reboot description earlier. And actually, people who practice this throughout the day, let's say they do it a half dozen times a day, the studies show they do become more mindful. They do become more present centered because they're taking these timeouts, if you will, throughout the day, maybe after a stressful situation, maybe before going into a stressful situation they know is coming up. And that helps them to stay in the present moment. We also know this thing called mindful living does that too. And that's simply doing the things you do every day, routinely, but paying attention to them instead of letting your mind go off somewhere else. Mindful eating's a classic example of that. When people eat mindlessly, they sit down, they scarf down their food, and they get done and they go, what did I just eat? Okay, so mindful eating is when you use your senses to fully enjoy and experience that process. If you do that throughout the day with your routine habits, brushing your teeth, taking a shower, cooking, whatever it is you do every day routinely, but do them by staying in the present instead of letting your mind go off, then that approach promotes more mindfulness as well. And then, of course, the primary method that people use to create a mindful mindset is meditation. And there are a lot of people who say, oh, I can't meditate. I sit down, my mind goes crazy, which it's supposed to. And there's also people that say, I just can't sit still that long, whatever. The studies show you only need to meditate 5 to 10 minutes a day. That's it. 5 to 10 minutes a day. And after about 5 to 6 weeks of daily practice like that, you will experience better emotional self-regulation, better capacity to focus on what's happening in the present moment, and greater self-awareness. So it doesn't take much of an investment to get that effect. Now, a lot of people will say, well, I've tried meditating, I can't quiet my mind. You're not supposed to quiet your mind. Meditation is not about having a blue sky mind, okay? Meditation is a training program for your brain. At the center in Madison, they call it bicep curls for the brain, okay? And what you're really doing, you need to be distracted by your thoughts in order to learn meditation. Let's say you sit down, you do a breathing meditation, you're trying to focus on your breath. Maybe you get through 3 or 4 breaths, and the next thing you know, you're thinking about what you're going to have for lunch, So that's okay. What you want to do is when you get distracted, then you refocus. Distracted, refocus. Distracted, refocus. That's what we call the training moment that teaches the brain to be more mindful. So if you're sitting there going, well, I get distracted, you should be. Use it to your advantage. Last thing, resilient people are compassionate with themselves. They don't beat themselves up mentally. They don't, take themselves to the woodshed, so to speak. They're kind to themselves. They accept the fact that they have flaws, that they're human, they'll make mistakes. Doesn't mean they want to, but they're like everybody else, right? So they compassionately connect with themselves. And one of the ways they do this is they will, if they find themselves in this loop where they're kind of down on themselves, they'll ask the question, well, if my own best friend was in my head, what would she or he say to me? What would that person say to me? And that kind of gives them a blueprint for how they should be treating themselves, the same way their best friend would treat them, so to speak. So it's kind of like being your own best friend and practicing the art of what we call good enough. Okay, I think we're pretty close to being out of time, but I want to give you one last thing here. These are just some closing thoughts from people about realistic optimism and so on and so forth, but I really want to point out just two of these to you. The first one being from Grace Lichtenstein, who said, your opponent in the end is never really the team on the other side of the field or the problem bedeviling your existence. Your opponent is yourself, your negative internal voices, your level of determination. When we're up against an outside stressor like the pandemic, we may think that that's our real adversary, and it is, but the bigger adversary is if we find ourselves losing control of our capacity to be resilient and manage our own feelings. That's a greater enemy in the face of this than the pandemic itself. And I love that quote right at the bottom by Dorothea Brand, who said, act boldly and unseen forces will come to your aid. That may sound a little woo-woo, but I have seen this over and over again, that when people sort of say, I'm taking charge of me, I'm going to do my best, even if I don't succeed, I'm going to give it my all, that unseen forces seem to come to their aid. Don't ask me to explain that. I don't know how it happens, but I've seen it over and over again. Okay, so that's my wrap and I'm sticking to it. What we do know, again, is resilience is probably the most critical capacity, mental capacity to have in the face of something like a pandemic, and that you build it primarily through realistic optimism and all those elements that that I touched on with you here this morning.
Okay, at this time, I'm unpinning the video.
I'm going to stop the share.
Questions in the chat. Maybe you can take those first.
Well, there is just one. And that question is, excuse me, how is music being incorporated into the therapy for people with mental illness or other chronic conditions?
That's a good question. We do know that music, of course, has to be a kind of music you like, but we do know that music has a direct impact on electrical activity and hormonal activity in the brain. So if you know that there are certain kinds of music, for example, that inspire you or give you hope or give you optimism or that give you kind of a hit of sentimentality even, those are things that we know will be helpful for people who are struggling with mental illness or even chronic pain. There are studies showing that music, again, of the kind you enjoy, reduces chronic pain. And increasingly, music is used in psychotherapy as an adjunct, if you will, to the therapeutic process. I know a lot of therapists who encourage clients to listen to music as a way of de-stressing and gaining some of that perspective.
Okay, I'm unmuting everybody, so if you have questions, please ask them now.
May I follow up on my question then? I thank you very much for being here, Mr. Chard, and also for answering on music. I am a person with hearing loss, and what I have a hard time with my cochlear implants is music. And is anyone studying the impact of the lack of music on people who have hearing loss?
I'm aware of a couple of studies on that, but I've seen them a long time ago, and I'd have to hunt around to see if I can find them for you. My older brother is a late deafened adult. Played the piano when he was younger, and certainly enjoyed and loved music, and then lost that capacity for music. And I remember some conversations I had with him in which he talked about how he would because he was hearing younger and then lost his hearing later, that he would play the songs in his mind, in his head, as a way to kind of substitute for the loss of the actual sensory input. The reason that's important is because the mind does not distinguish nearly as much between internal experience, imagined, if you will, experience, and experience out here that we call real. So if you're able to replay a song in your head, so to speak, your brain's going to react to it in a similar way as if it was actually listening to it from the outside.
Fabulous. Thank you.
You're welcome.
If you interact with optimistic people, does that make you more optimistic?
It is, unless you have an oppositional disorder like I do. So, you know, if you find yourself reflexively reacting to, well, don't be so positive all the time, kind of thing. But no, in general, I'm just trying to be cute. In general, what we really know is that positivity does tend to be contagious. And there was a major study done on showing that people tend to coalesce in social networks around people who are either negative because they feel negative, so they want to be with like-minded people, or people who are more positive in their attitude. And so there's this clustering we see in social groups between people who tend to be, again, more on the positive versus negative side. If you are a highly sensitive person, meaning someone who has a high degree of emotional sensitivity, and you react very strongly to emotional events, that's about 20% of the population. But if you're a highly sensitive person and you get into a group of people who are very optimistic and positive people, you're going to absorb a lot of that into yourself. If you tend to be less of a sensitive person, meaning you're more on that kind of, I got good armor, which isn't a bad thing to have sometimes. I got good emotional armor on. I don't absorb as much from my environment. You wouldn't get as much of that, you know, uplifting effect. But in general, yes, who you're around, their moods influence your mood.
There's one more question in the chat.
What is the name of the organization in Madison you mentioned? That's the one I see.
Yes.
Is that it? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's they have a website that's really interesting to look at. It's called the Center for Healthy Minds. The Center for Healthy Minds. It's a part of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I think it's in the psychology department. It's a neuroscience research center. They got about 42 eggheads there. I'm a former egghead, so I can say that, who do nothing but study the impact on the brain and on well-being associated with a variety of contemplative practices, not just meditation. And they're headed up by a gentleman by the name of Richard Davidson, or Richie Davidson. And he's the guy who some of you may recall brought the Dalai Lama to Madison a number of times. He was behind all that. And the Dalai Lama actually sent some of his monks over to the neuroscience lab in Madison to be studied, have their brains studied. So it's a fascinating place. They have a sister organization called Healthy Minds Innovations. And Healthy Minds Innovations has a very sophisticated and well-researched app. There's an app for everything, right? They have an app that can teach people meditation and contemplative practices. And I'm not sure the status of the app now, but at one point it was free. So if you go to the Center for Healthy Minds website, which is centerhealthyminds.org, I think it's org. If it's not, it's edu. Centerhealthyminds.org or .edu. That'll get you linked into all their stuff.
Are there nations or cultures that are more optimistic, and what can we learn from them, and where do we stand on that list?
Not good. Yes, to answer your question, there are nations that in studies of happiness and life satisfaction around the world, they've been able to demonstrate that the nations that have the highest levels of life satisfaction are what we call we cultures, meaning cultures in which people have a sense of community, a sense of we're all in this together. It's not just about me or my family or my, 401k. It's a much bigger kind of thing. And we as a society are focused on the common good, not just the individual good. Those societies have lower rates of depression, lower rates of anxiety, and higher life satisfaction. The United States it has a mix of both, but we tend to be more of a me culture than a we culture. And there's some studies showing that our orientation to me, myself, and mine is a ticket to higher levels of stress and mental challenges.
I just want to speak up for Bruce Wiggins. Bruce, you said you had a question?
Yes. I'd like your observations on the difference between the subject realistic hope or realistic optimism and hope. We run into a lot of people who say they want to have hope in the world, but I think that too often means they want positive outcomes, and if they don't get the positive outcomes they want, they're discouraged. So I think there's a difference, and I really like your formulation for realistic optimism. But could you comment on the difference between that and hope and the importance of that in mental health?
Yeah, well, you said it really well. I would add to that simply that we do know that, again, the hope that's based on realistic optimism is, again, hope in the effort. It's hope in, I'm going to do my best. I'll give it all I've got, but I am not going to tag my hope to the outcome. I'm not going to say, oh, if I don't succeed, I'm going to give up. I'm going to lose hope. There are lots of studies, and Frankl did some of these studies that show that people who have that kind of realistic optimism versus just pie in the sky optimism are much more resilient in the face of setbacks in their lives. So the impact on mental health is profound. If you pin all your hopes on, oh, it's going to go my way, and then it doesn't, then we all know what happens. You can collapse into not only disappointment, but also anger, despair, and you're on your way to a very bad place. However, if your mindset is, however it turns out, whatever the outcome, my purpose is to give it all I've got, and I'll do my best, and then the chips fall, then if the chips don't fall your way, your hope is not going to be devastated by that. It may be, you may be disappointed, but you're not going to feel like somebody just ripped your soul out.
Yeah. The comment being that the challenges we face as a society now, including climate change and racial equity, are so daunting, and the chances of succeeding 100% are so large, and the setbacks we will get will be coming frequently enough that this realistic optimism, I think, is a real breath of fresh air. And another comment that this is a real wonderful compliment to our service this morning. So if some of you haven't heard the service and Jennifer's sermon, I really suggest these two go together. So thank you, Lorraine, for your leadership in bringing Philip here this morning.
Thank you. It was several people, but thank you.
I have a question.
Sure.
You mentioned spirit, and now I can't remember where and how to succinctly ask this question, but what I've run into is a lot of people who don't have a realistic optimism. They have a outcome optimism, and it's been stressing them out. And I have had challenges trying to articulate this other way of, be here now, mindfulness. And what I've started realizing is in my experience, they fall into a category if they don't believe there's something bigger than themselves with energy that they can pull in. And how should I speak to these people in a way that isn't dismissive, but encouraging and not lecturing and not standing like I'm on a soapbox?
Well, I've struggled with that myself. I think that overall what we find in those situations is it's helpful to use a metaphor, an example, an anecdote, something like that. A lot of times with some people I've used kind of sports metaphors, interestingly enough, because sports is all about the score, right? Who wins, who loses, that kind of thing. And what I'll say to them is the difference between a realistic optimist and an outcome optimist, great term, by the way, I hadn't had that one before. A realistic optimist and the other kind is that they're in the zone. They're just playing the game, and they're not looking at the scoreboard, and they're not thinking about what's going to happen next. They're just in that moment. And when you're in the moment, most people have had those experiences where they became so absorbed in what they were doing and a positive thing that they stopped worrying about how it was going to turn out, and they kind of let go of all those, what's going to happen next things. And they felt that kind of sense of aliveness and engagement with life and energy that comes from that. And that's kind of a proof positive of the power of realistic optimism. So I'll often, talk to them about those kinds of examples, if you will. But to go back to your first point, which was an excellent one, when we don't have a spiritual connection of some kind, whether it's, with a deity or a philosophy or, the universe or whatever that is to you, then you're on your own, right? And so when things don't turn out well for you personally, you don't have a backdrop. You don't have something you can fall back on and go, well, this didn't go well for me. But on the other hand, I still have this sense that there is good in the world, that there's purpose in the world, and I can lean on that while I suffer my own personal disappointments.
Well, I think we have a little time left for maybe one more question, but I wanted to mention that the forums are now live streamed on YouTube. Someone asked if it's available online, and it's at the UU Milwaukee channel on YouTube. So you can find this.
First Unitarian Society of Milwaukee. You really need to Google or whatever, the First Unitarian Society of Milwaukee YouTube.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Bruce. Can you see any other questions, Bruce, or?
No, we're fine.
No, I think we're good.
I hear something.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah. It's me again.
Okay, follow up.
So the other question I have, I ran into this when I went through a really traumatic episode. I would get a lot of comments from people about, oh, just cheer up. Oh, just this. Oh, just that. And then about 4 years after that, something went around Facebook with toxic positivity statements. Yep. But what it didn't say, which I would love to hear about, is when somebody comes at you, they're coming at you because that's what they think is the thing you need to hear. But how do you respond to them? Because what I found myself doing was going, and I'm an actress, so please forgive me, I'm a little bit over, but I held it inside, but I'm sure they saw it in my eyes because it's hard to mask everything. What's a good way to not growl at people, but hear what they say and then maybe re-educate them on what's more useful to somebody in trouble?
Sure. Well, depending on how much of that toxic positivity you're getting, you also might want to decide, as we say, what hill do you want to die on? So it's like, is it important enough for me to address, first of all? But secondly, if you do decide to address it, what's usually helpful is to assume positive intention on part of the person. You're not saying that to make you feel worse. They're just maybe a little clueless about how to be helpful. And so, and to say that to them, I want to give you some feedback about what you just said. I realize that you said that because you care about me and you wanted to help me and you want me to feel better. And I really appreciate that. Let me also tell you what impact that has on me. And then you make an I statement about when you said such and so, I felt da 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 da. And that's just, if that person is truly your friend and truly does care about you, then usually, even if not in the moment, later on, they're going to be able to absorb that message a little bit. And if they have enough self-awareness, they might change their behavior. But that's the best way to do it, is assume a positive intent, say that to them. I realize you're trying to be helpful. Let me tell you what impact that has for me. And that's probably the best you can do. But again, in my own experience, when I encounter toxic positivity, I always ask myself, again, is this the hill I want to die on today?
Thank you. That's why
You're
talking to
welcome.
these is helpful. They don't come back at you with stating,
Exactly.
never mind, that's a whole nother thing. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that this has been extremely helpful, and I really appreciate your deep research base for this this information. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very kind of you.
May I just ask a short question about, I'm fascinated by the idea of the brain not distinguishing between imaginary versus realistic. And since we're going to have to be isolating probably some more with the high COVID numbers, I've been admiring your background, the visual background.
Oh.
And I'm thinking that people who are not able to get out, those with various disabilities or illnesses, that it may be a very good thing to be looking at beautiful nature pictures on, whether on television or online if they can.
Yes, and thanks for bringing that up. There is, in the field of ecopsychology, there are some studies showing that even when we look at nature virtually, like on a screen or a picture, maybe a photograph you have, or even a painting of nature that you have at home, that while the effect isn't as great as it would be if you were actually out there in the middle of it, because that's a full sensory immersion kind of experience, just the visual effect is helpful for people. And the same is true with things like bringing growing plants indoors, having a pet, as long as they're not, a pet from hell kind of thing. You've seen the studies about people watching aquarium fish and how their blood pressure goes down just by staring at these fish swimming around in a tank. So yeah, bringing nature indoors. Some people have little displays in their homes, like with rocks and feathers and pine cones, and any kind of visual. Anytime you bring nature in, you're going to get some of that effect.
Wonderful, thank you.
You're welcome.
Make them a terrarium.
There you go.
Well, thank you, Phil, so much. I'm an eco-psychologist, and it seems like one of the really difficult issues in a way is, like Bruce was saying before, given the magnitude of the problems, and I'll leave out the politics of the pandemic here, but maybe focus more on something like climate change. One of the difficulties, especially as a Jungian analyst, you kind of get lumped in with a lot of new age people and kind of not airy-fairy, but kind of overly positive attitudes. So it's a challenge of trying to be optimistic and have some hope for our species, and yet to let the depth of the grief and the angst and everything like that sink in to keep driving us to more fundamental understanding of what's going on, what the basic issues are, and how to address these deep and complex issues at the proper level. So I've always had a little bit of problem, or at least I must say a fair amount of problem with the optimist and the resilience. You don't want to be, you don't want to have a resilience and adaptation to, like, okay, I've got stage 1 cancer, I gotta be optimistic here. It's like, no, you really got to think hard and deep and work with some fundamental reorientation to address the situation. So that's a basic issue I have.
Yeah, I agree. I run into that myself. And I think the point you made is, excuse me, a really good one, which is plain old optimism just doesn't carry the day when things are tough. And you have to have that realistic component to it. And the realistic component to it is a recognition that you could fail, that you may not get what you want, that we may be going in a bad direction. That's realistic in some situations. Denying that isn't going to help you and isn't going to help the situation either. So the optimism, the positivity has to have a realistic component, or it'll take you in the wrong direction. Excuse me.
Okay, I think this is probably a great time to end the session. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Yes,
Yeah,
I agree.
Yeah, much
you.
appreciated. Thank you, everyone, for your time and your interest. I appreciate it very much.
Oh,
Many thanks.
And